You think that it really is as important as many commentators are suggesting?
It's indeed an existential election, in the sense that if President Erdogan wins another term, the country is going to further degenerate into authoritarianism, where elections will not matter. Talk to people on the ground in Turkey, you'll see that excitement, that people are mobilized, and opposition supporters genuinely believe that change is possible.
This is The Global Gambit. Greetings, Internet, and welcome back. What is the potential implications of the Turkish election? How significant could they be for not just the domestic, but the foreign policy of the country? When I think of Turkey, I think of a lot of different fingers in pies, if that makes sense, because Turkey is such a pivotally important country for so many different issues. And this election in just over a week in the country is going to be absolutely, I think, pivotal. Joining me today to talk about those things is Gonul Tol, one of my favorite, and I genuinely mean that, everybody. You must check out her profile on the Middle East Institute, director of the Turkey program at MEI. We've been lucky enough to have some speakers from there before, but I'm delighted to welcome you, Gonul, to the Global Gambit. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Piotr, and thanks for the kind words. I'm really flattered. You know, everywhere across the world, politicians say that the upcoming elections in their country is an existential vote. And in Turkey's case, that is actually true.
So you don't find that I love the fact that you go straight into it, by the way. You don't find that there is a over hyperbole around the election. You think that it really is as important as many commentators are suggesting. And could you outline a little bit for us why that is? Just could you maybe give us a very broad overview of the candidates, what's at play here, and then we can dive into some details on some specifics.
Okay, so it's indeed an existential election, in the sense that if President Erdogan wins another term, the country is going to further degenerate into authoritarianism, where elections will not matter. Right now, Turkey is considered to be an autocratic country, so there are elections. And the elections are competitive. The race is competitive, but the elections are not free and fair. But if you talk to people on the ground in Turkey, you'll see that excitement, that people are mobilized, and opposition supporters genuinely believe that change is possible through elections. So that means that the majority of the country still have a lot of faith in the electoral process. And that's a must if you want to rebuild democracy in any country, in any setting. So that's great news. But I think if Erdogan wins another term, I think people will lose that faith in the electoral process. So I see that more of a possibility in Turkey, because Turkish politics under Erdogan is going to be even more unstable, given the dire state of Turkish economy, institutional problems, a post-earthquake context. So Turkey is going to be more unstable, and autocrats, when they face unstable domestic context, they double down on repression and pursue an even more aggressive foreign policy abroad. And obviously, Turkey has been playing an important role in international affairs. So the election results will have implications not just for the country's domestic politics and the regime type, but it will also have an impact on what Turkey does beyond its borders. And I'll say this and I'll stop. I think the most important implication is going to be for the future of democracy across the world. If pro-democracy actors in Turkey manage to beat down an entrenched autocrat like Erdogan, I think we will have more hope for the future of democracy. We are living at a time when autocracy is surging. But if pro-democracy forces win elections, I think people will believe in the prospects of autocrats can be brought down through elections.
Kind of leads me to a question which was floating around in the back of my mind when I attended the Chatham House event yesterday and listening to you and the fellow speakers. Why isn't there seemingly more positive, upbeat energy around this election, right? And to premise my point or question is because, as you say, this is so symbolically important for potentially just how many things it could improve. Now, I don't want to get get too carried away, but, this really could be an opportunity to see a more constructive Turkey in so many different theaters and issues, right? A more constructive partner in NATO, a more constructive member of the Middle East dynamic, helping to resolve the humanitarian migration crisis, although I'm sure we can unpack that and the details there. More of a hopefully constructive approach to Northern Africa. Again, I'm sort of positing a lot of different examples here, but why does there seem to be a sense of caution? Is that maybe the right word to use? Is it because it's not guaranteed that Erdogan will be beaten, or because the candidate, I've always struggled to pronounce his name, to be honest with you, is it because he is a bit of an unknown entity?
Sure. I'm not sure whether I agree with that assumption that there's not enough enthusiasm around the elections. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy, especially among the opposition supporters. If you follow any rally held by an opposition leader, Kılıçdaroğlu, İmamoğlu, or others, you will see the energy. So there's a lot of hope. People, for the first time in many years, maybe in 20 years, people are hopeful that change is actually possible. So I see that energy. You talk to people, you talk to young people, you talk to people who want change, and they are full of optimism. But on the other hand, they understand, as Lula supporters said in Brazilian elections, Lula is not going to be the door to heaven, he's going to be the door out of hell. So there is a similar sense of caution on that regard. People understand that the stakes are very high, and we could, on May 15th, wake up to a completely different Turkey. So many people have been longing for that. But on the other hand, they understand that not everything is going to be rosy, because the new government will be inheriting a long, huge list of problems, from a broken economy to a broken system to the rule of law. So the new government will basically have to rebuild the country from scratch. And that's a very difficult thing to do. What makes it even more difficult is the fact that we are, the team that's going to be in charge of that is a team of diverse, ideologically, politically diverse group of parties. And what keeps them together is their anti-Erdogan stance. So some assume that, well, what will happen once Erdogan is not in the picture? How are you going to keep that diverse coalition together to promise what they have, to do what they have promised to do? So that's why there's optimism, but there's caution. And there is one more factor that makes people cautious and somewhat pessimistic is this assumption that Erdogan, even if he loses the elections, he's not just going to walk away. Now that's different. I think that is, people still believe that if the elections were held free and fair, opposition would certainly win. But obviously they're neither free nor fair. And Erdogan, he has so much to lose. He's just not going to accept the election results. So that's also what makes some people pause. And I understand that. As someone who has worked on election security in Turkey, observed and took part in Turkish civil society organizations' efforts to protect the ballot, I understand all those concerns. So it's not entirely unfounded. But on the other hand, I would say this: Turkey is not Russia. Not yet. Elections still do matter, right? Even Putin, autocrats cannot really engage in the crudest forms of election rigging. Not the 21st century autocrats. They cannot use repression alone to stay in power. They need the veneer of legitimacy to stay in power. And these people, these autocrats, they come to power in the name of the people. And the main basis of their legitimacy is election. So that's why there are only so much that they can do to rig the elections. They engage in sophisticated election rigging, don't get me wrong. But if it's outright fraud, that's going to create a backlash. And we've seen that in 2019 elections in Istanbul, right? When Erdogan lost Istanbul in 2019, he didn't accept the result and he called for a rerun. And he lost even by a bigger margin. So people in Turkey love elections. And that's why I think Erdogan has to be careful in what he's going to do on the day of the election. And the second point that I would say to those who are extremely anxious about election security is this. I think in autocracies, even if autocrats don't accept results, and we've seen this in this country, not just in autocracies, but in democracies too. Remember, Trump didn't accept the results, and he could have had his way had it not for the institutions in this country. So if bureaucracy holds its ground, that changes everything. So imagine a scenario where Erdogan loses the elections by a narrow margin, doesn't accept the result, calls his supporters to the streets, and there's street violence. What will change the election results? I think where Turkish bureaucracy stands is the key there. And I'm not 100% sure that Turkish bureaucracy will back an Erdogan who has just lost elections and wants bureaucracy to overturn the results.
I think one of the things that fascinates me most is the Russian-Turkish relationship. I said it yesterday, and I'll say it again for our listeners, but I consider Turkey a bit of a Russia light in the sense of both are competitively authoritarianistic regimes, which is just a fancy way of saying that they have all the aspects of a democracy. They hold elections, but the elections aren't really fair and free. They are supposed to have, an independent judicial system, but there's a politicalization. That's sort of where Hungary is going, right? You can put every country on a political spectrum from liberal democracy to totalitarian state. And Turkey and Russia are an interesting hybrid regime. And I think Turkey is a little bit less of a version of Russia because Erdogan still has to win favor with his electorate, whilst Putin basically doesn't. But I want to unpack a little bit more the candidate who is challenging Erdogan. If you could take us through a little bit about him, his backers, the opposition coalition, because I think a lot of people they're interested in Turkey, but maybe don't know the intricate details. But also a sort of tag-on question to that is, could this not be a potential obstacle in the sense of we have a coalition of opposition parties whose biggest commonality is their mutual desire to see Erdogan gone. If they achieve that, does that not lead to the potential for infighting, political paralysis? Because, ideas about dealing with the humanitarian crisis, the economy, foreign policy towards Ukraine, name it. So what's your perspectives on that, I guess I would say?
On Kılıçdaroğlu, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is the opposition bloc's presidential candidate. And he is the polar opposite. He's a man who is considered to be very honest. He's known for his war against corruption. He is a man who believes in institutions, and he is a former bureaucrat. Actually, I think it was in the 1990s where he was awarded as the bureaucrat of the year. So Erdogan is none of these things. He's after 20 years in power. His regime has been as a perfect example of how power corrupts. Corruption is so widespread and has become so systemic under Erdogan's rule. And he does not believe in the institutions. He actually has destroyed the country's institutions. So there is today nothing except for one man who calls all the shots. And that's why the opposition pledges to rebuild the country's institutions from scratch. And he is a populist leader. He's a very polarizing figure. He often plays the culture card, attacks the LGBTQ community. He mobilizes people. He divides people along religious, ethnic, and sectarian lines. Whereas Kılıçdaroğlu, his campaign narrative is a very unifying narrative. He released an excellent video in which he embraced his Alevi identity. And many of them, when people started circulating his name as a potential candidate, a lot of people paused because they thought, this is not a great idea. He's old, he's not charismatic, and he's He's not a member of the Sunni majority. So Erdogan is definitely going to attack him on that. So he stands zero chance against Erdogan. So that was the narrative. And then here we are. We have a man. He's, yes, not young. He's not very charismatic. And yet, I think he turned out to be a better campaigner than many of us had expected. He is known to be Turkey's quiet force. So no matter how much attack Erdogan unleashes on him, he's always quiet. And I think that's exactly what Turkey needs at the moment. That's why I call Kılıçdaroğlu Turkey's Biden. And this is Turkey's Biden moment. Because remember, when back in 2019, during the primaries, when we were talking about whether Biden was going to win the primaries, everyone was saying he shouldn't, he's not charismatic, he's old, he doesn't stand a chance against Trump. No, he's not the man. And yet he won the primaries and he won the election. And I think mainly because he was the right man for that very moment, because he was a person who could unify a very polarized country. He was a person who could reach across the aisle, talk to the Republicans. So Kılıçdaroğlu is that guy, is Turkey's Biden, in a sense that he can talk to anyone and he can be this unifying figure. So that's why I think person who is going to win the next elections will be sitting on a lot of power afforded by the executive presidency. And
just to interject on that, but isn't the polls illustrating that the two are quite close?
That's right. This is going to be a tight race, but again, remember, this is an autocracy. So even despite how Erdogan manipulated the playing field in his favor, this is still a tight race. Even AKP's own polls suggest that this is not going to be easy for Erdogan. So that is, I think, you have to give it to the opposition. I think they are doing a good job. They managed to unify. And remember, autocrats, they don't need majorities to stay in power, to destroy democracy. All they need is divided oppositions. And this time around, Turkey managed to unify around one candidate. We have other contenders, which really risks winning in the first round, but still, I think this is good enough. So in that regard, I think the opposition is doing a good job. And I think your question about if Erdogan is gone, will the opposition disintegrate? I think that's spot on. And you're right. One thing that unites these people together, brings them together, the opposition bloc, is they all want Erdogan gone. And once he's gone, what is going to keep them together? And this is how I think. I think Erdogan will not be gone. Even if he loses the elections, he's going to stay around. So we're not going to see a Bolsonaro scenario here where Erdogan flees the country, definitely not going to Florida to eat chicken. But I think he's definitely going to be around, because remember, Erdogan is still, despite everything, all the problems that we're facing today, and all of them Erdogan's own doing, still he commands 40% of the vote. So he's still pretty popular. And I think if the opposition wins, he's going to be sticking around waiting for the opposition to fail. So maybe like what Netanyahu did, right? So he can come back with a vengeance. So
I was going to say, actually, it just makes me think of Israel, the situation with Bibi Netanyahu. For listeners and viewers, Israel has had its obviously democratic constitutional crises. We had Nadav Eyal, can't say that. We had Nadav Eyal, well-known Israeli commentator, and he was saying very similar to what you're saying, which is if you don't have the entity, this opposition group, coalition, cooperating effectively, then if it disintegrates, well, then that just leads to the perfect opportunity of the one, resilient individual to come back through. And we'll see Erdogan suddenly coming back on along. It's like, that's the last thing I want to see, to be honest with you. But it is giving me vibes of Israel. I don't know, just very simply, how optimistic do you feel about the coalition's resiliency? And what do you think that their priorities are going to be if they win? What would be top of the agenda domestic or foreign policies, or a mixture of?
Well, obviously, as I said, since Erdogan is going to be around, this just that gives the opposition bloc a big motivation to stick together, even after winning the elections, because he can come back any day, right? So they have to stick together, and they have to stick together to be able to carry out all the promises that they've made. They need the Kurdish support as well if they want to pass anything in the parliament, right? So that is a strong motivation. And I think their priority is going to be tackling the economic crisis. That's number one worry of the voters. So the opposition put together an excellent economy team. I think they're all top-rate economists, professors, analysts. So I think they have an advantage there, but obviously it's going to be extremely difficult to undo all the damage that Erdogan has done in the 20 years, including because to fix economic problems, you can't just fix economy by fixing economy, right? You have to build trust in the institutions. You have to rebuild those institutions. You have to make sure that the central bank is independent again. So there's a lot to do before you can address the economic problems. So I think that will be priority number one. And number two, which is not unrelated, is how are they going to address the post-earthquake situation? 11 provinces have been hit by the earthquake, millions of people. Many of them still suffering, by the way. They live in tents. Many of them have been relocated. They don't have jobs. There are still tens of thousands of people under the rubble. So that's a huge task, and that has to be a priority as well. One of the pledges that the opposition has made is switching the country's parliamentary presidential system back to a reformed form of parliamentary system. That should be a priority on the one hand, but on the other hand, again, the new president is going to need a lot of political capital to be able to materialize all his promises. And that means, I think, he's going to have to wait. He's going to wait a couple of years before switching back to a parliamentary system, because, again, he's going to need those powers afforded to the president by the Turkish-style presidency Erdogan has established. And there is also the Kurdish problem. I think what makes this election dramatically different from 2018 election is the support afforded by the pro-Kurdish party to the opposition candidate. Remember, in 2018, the conditions there were really different. There were little different factors playing out there. But the pro-Kurdish party's support is very critical because the HDP base is a large constituency. We're talking about 10, 11%. And in a tight race like this one, it really matters who Kurds decide to support, and they decided to support Kılıçdaroğlu. So that means that after the elections, the new government has to do something to resolve the Kurdish question. It's not going to happen immediately. It's a very complicated problem, but they have to start taking steps immediately to secure Kurdish backing in the parliament for their agenda.
How much do you think that the earthquake had a direct implication on Erdogan's, prospects? Because what I find is, in times of crises, effective or ineffective crisis management for a leader, particularly an autocratic one or a semi-autocratic one, can be, a decisive factor, right? How many times have we seen this happen in, past days where you suddenly get an unexpected shock event, and that leads to the, shift in polls for a leader to another one, right? In the UK, we had our own absolute calamity with Liz Truss, and that completely changed the poll ratings around for the Conservative to the Labour Party. I know it's a bit of a far-fetched example comparison, but it's that. So do you think that had a big role to play, or not so much? And what more can be done to address the seemingly systemic problems with earthquakes? Because the buildings seem to be all poorly constructed, and it could happen again. It's a very volatile, geographically speaking, part of the world.
disasters of this magnitude, they can bring down autocrats, but it's not a straightforward process. Because you need several things. First you need time, because usually people, after a natural crisis like this, people rally around the leader because there's so much uncertainty in their lives that they go for the person who they've known. They don't have to love that leader, but there's always this rally around the leader, they rally around the flagged impact after natural crises like this. And we've seen that after COVID, right? After COVID, for instance, Trump did and said all the wrong things, and yet his support, he had this surge in support for Trump right after COVID. So I think we saw a similar thing happening in Turkey as well. If Erdogan waited a bit longer, I think that picture would turn in the sense that I think people would understand as more time passed, people really feel the impacts, even people who have not been directly impacted by the earthquake, they would feel the impact of the earthquake in their pocketbooks. There would be just more debate on that. But that's one of the reasons why Erdogan didn't want to delay the elections, because time was not on his side. So he wanted to hold the elections as soon as possible. So that's one reason why we did not see a dramatic drop in support for Erdogan because of the earthquake. But yet earthquake did something, which was before the earthquake, there was a surge in support for Erdogan in the months leading up to the earthquake. The earthquake stopped that. So in that regard, it did have an impact. And the second impact the earthquake had on Turkish domestic politics was that the unlike Erdogan and the ruling party and his ruling allies, opposition parties immediately mobilized and sent aid to the earthquake hit zones. And that did something that changed an image that Erdogan has been trying to paint for the opposition, which was these people only talk. They cannot fix anything. They're all talk, no action. They are very incompetent. Yeah. So I think their response, the opposition's response to the earthquake, changed that image. And I think the people on the ground, the victims, appreciated that. So in that regard, I think it had an impact too. But again, it did not automatically translate into a dramatic shift or dramatic drop in support for Erdogan. I think the more long-lasting impact is going to be felt in the months to come, and that's why I think the new government dealing with the problems caused by the earthquake is going to be one of the priorities of the new government.
Gonul, my final question for you in this part one of hopefully part two, when we have you back, is what do you think about foreign reactions? So yesterday we had a question about, it was mainly about Turkey outwards. But my question, similar to the other one, is what about looking into Turkey? What do you think foreign entities, governments will be looking out for and hoping, and how do you think that they could engage depending upon how the election is run? If that rather blurry question makes sense to you.
Well, so far, I think the Western countries have been quiet, and maybe understandably so, because in a country where anti-Western sentiment is very strong, probably they don't want to do any harm to those who want change in the country, so they've been quiet. I think that's the most optimistic reading of Western response to the elections. At least I know that in this town in Washington, here, both the administration officials and American bureaucracy, they're being very careful not to be seen as interfering in elections in any way. But on the other hand, you have autocrats who support each other, right? Erdogan, the Saudis injected cash into Turkish economy. Russians did as well. Not in this one, but in previous elections, Chinese President Xi Jinping came to the help of Erdogan. So you can see autocratic regimes teaming up against Western democratic countries and helping each other out. So if you look at from their point of view, what would be the ideal scenario? I think certainly, countries like Russia, for instance, they certainly want another Erdogan term in Turkey because Erdogan has done really well for them. After the invasion of Ukraine, Erdogan has thrown an economic lifeline to an isolated Putin. There are thousands of Russian companies set up in the country. You have Russian oligarchs roaming around, welcome in the country. So that is obviously a huge gift to Putin. And I'm not sure whether he can expect the same warm welcome from a new government. And this is not to say that if there's a new government in Ankara after the elections, that Turkey is not going to be working with Russia. I'm not saying that at all. Yes, Turkey will work with Russia. First and foremost, it's an important trade and energy partner. So that means that you will see cooperation between the two countries, no matter who wins the elections. But maybe the difference could be, maybe the new government is not going to be that willing to allow Putin to circumvent Russian sanctions, right? Mm-hmm. So that even in itself could be a huge dramatic change and might be one of the reasons why Putin wants Erdogan to win. And other countries, Gulf countries too, I think there's a funny story. I was talking to a Saudi official once and I said, how come you're now backing Erdogan? Because the Jamal Khashoggi affair left a sour taste in your mouth. And especially Mohammed bin Salman is not a big fan of Erdogan. So how come you're backing him? And he said, well, we don't have that notion of change of power through elections. So we automatically assume that Erdogan is going to be there forever. So why don't you just work with the guy? And that makes perfect sense from their point of view.
Depressingly sort of honest, isn't it, really?
It is. And that's right. And if you look at the European and the Western governments in general, I think I don't want to be cynical here. I truly hope, and this is something that I've been pushing here too, that we should all the Western world should welcome a democratic Turkey, because as I argue in my book, what Erdogan does on the foreign policy front is not just about foreign policy. If you don't pay attention to what he's doing domestically, you're never going to understand why he's doing what he's doing on the foreign policy front. If a country turns autocratic, it's not just the problem of the citizens of that country. Those autocrats become your problems. And we've seen that in Ukraine, right? So that's why Western countries should embrace a democratic Turkey, support a democratic Turkey. But I'm not quite sure whether things will turn out that way, because you have a European Union which has formed this transactional partnership with Erdogan. They have long given up on Turkish democracy and constantly focusing on the refugee deal. So imagine if the opposition wins and you see a new country, a more democratic country, will the EU have the excuse that it has used under Erdogan, which was Turkey is an authoritarian country, it cannot become a member of EU? They won't have that excuse anymore. So if they don't have that excuse, what are they going to say? Yeah, sorry, it really doesn't matter whether you're democratic or authoritarian. It's just because you're Muslim and we don't want more Muslims. So that's going to be inconvenient. From Washington's point of view, it could be a little different. Not that this town pays a lot of attention to Turkish democracy, but really? I can easily, at least from the administration point of view, and we're talking about an administration that has been saying that democracy and human rights is the backbone of their foreign policy. And Biden shook hands with Mohammed bin Salman, right? So when it's always geostrategic concerns, Trump concerns over democracy and human rights, right? So I think, but But on the other hand, I haven't completely lost hope. I think there are those, both in the administration and in the Congress, who really want to see a more democratic Turkey and who would welcome a more democratic Turkey.
Well, there you have it, everyone. A preview, I guess you could say, of the Turkish election, predominantly focusing on domestic, its own immediate challenges, the candidates a little bit. In part 2, we will have a foreign policy specific focus. I am deliberately steering away from foreign policy for this, as I say, preview, because I would love to have you back for a second part. Gonul, before we end this episode, is there any takeaways you want to emphasize for our listeners? Anything you want to really underline about the election?
Well, I'm always in this town, I'm asked of my opinion about what I see as the most likely scenario. And this is what I think. And I keep saying this because by nature, I'm not an optimistic person. And yet I am optimistic about the prospects of the opposition this time around. This is not to say that I don't lose sleep over concerns about election security. But on the other hand, I think the opposition has done a good enough job. And this time things could be different. And all we need to do as Turkish citizens is to go out and vote.
Thank you very much. And thank you for watching. We'll be back. Like, comment, subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Take care.